Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of Liberty Theory. Ryan and I recently came across this subject, just organically talking amongst ourselves, about how the reliance on government is also it has an implication with science. Or at least we believe there's a correlation, or maybe even causation, if that's the right word for it. But basically, our thesis is uh, the embracing of government and or the central planning of society is a rejection of science. We could just get down to it. Ryan, I'll let you go first.
Yeah,
How do you break
yeah,
that down?
yeah. When we were talking about this before, uh, I'd almost prefer to say maybe not the word science, but maybe just interacting with reality,
Sure.
um, which is kind of like science. Um, but but what really got me thinking about it was the concept of spontaneous order. And I was actually speaking to one of my children about this, and I used the example of deer population. And if humans are completely absent the picture, the deer population will be in check no matter what, given enough time. Uh, so it's the example that you learn in sophomore biology in high school. The deer population gets too high, their food supply goes down, and then suddenly there's competition for food. Some some of them starve or don't get enough to eat, can't reproduce. Their population shoots down, the food supply goes up, and eventually you reach an equilibrium again uh, between the deer population and their environment.
Sure.
And it just got me thinking about uh, how all of the best intentions of state programs fly in the face of how we know problems get solved. So if so, if you have a population and it can't feed itself, a couple things have to happen. One, there needs to be less of them. Two, the resources need to be increased. Any number of things need to happen to bring that back into equilibrium.
Sure.
And with the typical welfare program, you're not ever creating an equilibrium or a sustainable environment. What you're doing is you are pumping obsolescent resources into the environment and never actually solving the problem.
Right,
Uh,
because if you ever take those resources back, then you're back in a kind of a starvation, uh,
yes.
risk there for that population.
So, so anti-science. I guess it's a way to put it, but we know how these things work. Uh, if you have a deer population that's too high, you can't just you could fly helicopters over the forest and just you know and just throw down tons of deer food, but you're not solving the problem. You're just making it worse. You're not creating an actual resolution.
Oh, right. It's kind of just like subsidizing, a bad situation, which obviously doesn't make it go away, and more often than not, it makes it worse.
Yep.
Right? Is that kind of
So
yeah?
um, and so that's sort of a shorter, medium term thing. Uh, but but take that one step further. Before we were recording, we were talking about evolution, and in the way, way long term, uh, Mother Nature is a sociopath, and uh, the animals that live on this earth have to be able to compete for resources. and that means there's losers every once in a while. Uh,
Right.
and and what we're doing with state programs is we're basically breeding populations that can't take care of themselves. And this is not humane.
Oh, right. Yeah. Fundamentally, it's yeah, obviously very very dangerous, especially if you kind of look at well. So evolution is the idea that organisms react to their environment, and over time, their biology changes in order to survive well in an environment. And so,
Sure.
uh, if you do something to get in the way of that, well, then whether it's feeding the deer that have overpopulated, or making an organism survive in an environment that it really shouldn't, you're only pushing off the inevitable. And now I feel like using these examples dehumanizes humans because, neither Ryan and I are saying just let poor people die, just let uh, poverty persist. We're talking more about ideas, the survival of ideas,
Sure.
and
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Yeah.
yeah, and so maybe ideas and habits and human
Yep.
action. We want the good human action to be prevalent and survive, and kind of dominate the society, and let the bad habits that don't lead to human flourishing, let those be, let them feel the weight of their own consequences, and eventually, get kind of pushed out of society or to a minority of people um, that still choose to engage in that. Um,
Listen, if um, tragedy cannot be legislated away,
oh yeah.
my parents are going to die. A law can't change that.
Mhm.
Um, Someone's going to be hit by a car tomorrow. A law can't change that. A flood's going to happen and kill a bunch of people. Um, so bad things will happen. This is really about, just like Ben said, this is really about perverting natural feedback mechanisms where bad things get punished and disincentivized and good things get rewarded.
Yep, exactly. And that kind of leads me to uh, one of the things one of the concepts that I've been playing around with my head, and I think it's pretty accurate. I mean, it's still new. I'm not married to the idea, but it relying on the state is kind of it's a rejection of the scientific method. I feel where uh, in order to be useful, it needs to be able to be used freely in um, finding out information with the world. I mean, you can't have people limiting what you're allowed to research and what you're allowed to test. It should be completely open, and then all that new information should be able to be used to improve society. Unfortunately, with the state, all the laws and regulations that it passes retard this effort, mainly because it's a one size fits all kind of deal. It's like, hey, you know what? We're in charge. We feel that this is the right way to do things, and so this is how it's going to be. And you know what? Nobody else is going to be able to compete, whether it's law or um, policing or maybe national defense or a lot of these big societal complex issues.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
are a lot of different ways to do it, but
Maybe,
the state locks us into one, and there's no way to. It's really hard to derail or fix it.
yeah, maybe. Tell me if I'm interpreting you right.
Sure.
Um, Science, just like the market, just like law ought to be, just like research ought to be, is a process of discovery.
Yes.
and uh, I think if I'm understanding you right, what you're saying is that the state does not discover truths in the same way that the sane world does.
No, not at all. And it doesn't really have an incentive to.
Yeah, boy, that's a pretty big statement there.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
definitely. And you can kind of blend, that with also being kind of a rejection of like evolution as it refers to ideas and methods for organizing society. Uh, the state is basically a monopoly on the scientific method, discovering things, and then using that information for society. And like I said before, it has no reason, real incentive to get better because there's no competing uh, organizations. If you think about it this way, like I mean, if you take if you go into the forest and remove all the wolves, well, then the deer
sure,
population is going to explode. Or if you remove all the
sure.
deer, the wolves are going to die because they have nothing to eat. It's
Yep.
kind of it's a perversion of balance and the ability to discover new things and then to use it to improve society. Because I think you could argue that our our law system has remained relatively unchanged, and there's been virtually no innovation in the laws or the courts. And in fact, they've been getting worse for a long time.
Well, sure. So yeah, in the subject of law, uh, yeah, I guess it could be argued. I'm not an expert on jurisprudence, but
Yeah.
uh, I, the idea of discovering law uh, seems seems pretty pretty much dead and gone, except maybe in like the Supreme Court. Uh,
Oh, right. In a
um,
way.
yeah, in a way. Um, it really seems to me that well, I mean it's obvious from everything. The most recent time a judge tried to discover law uh, was with the Hammond family down where the judge was like, this isn't terrorist arson. I'm
Oh,
not going to
right.
put you away for 5 years.
Right, yeah.
Um, yeah, but that's absolutely a no go. You've got the mandatory minimum sentences. You've got the well, I got to put you in jail for this weed because the law says so. Um,
Exactly. And so it's not about
not
justice anymore. It's about the estate.
not the discovered
Yeah.
law, not the organic law, not the common law, just the law from on high.
Right, yeah. Just basically sins you commit against the state is what it's turned a lot into. It's not about
Sure.
seeking justice or reparations for those who are injured. It's more about just, oh, you did something we don't like. Now it's time to drop the hammer. Um, but that's just like an
But
example, I think, of one area. You can
yeah,
expand this to technology, and actually, that's probably one of the best examples of, or kind of a free and kind of anarchic to a certain extent environment can do for innovation and discovering new things. Because we all know that technology changes constantly and at a breakneck pace. And that's mostly due to the fact that it's largely unregulated and people are allowed to operate in that space unmolested.
it's kind of funny. Yeah, I had uh, one of my kids' friends was over at our house, and the patents got brought up for something for their schooling,
Ooh,
and I said patents are just disgusting, evil nonsense, and
yeah.
and
A lot of blank stares. What?
yeah, a lot of blank stares, like what the hell are you talking about? Uh, so I didn't get to sit him down and lecture him, but it's like It's like when your sister says, "No, oh, that was my idea. You can't do
Right.
that."
It's so petty.
Um, but I feel like we're competing a little bit here because I think we're running parallel to each other with what we're thinking about, but we're not quite aligned. When we first started talking about this, I really just couldn't escape the idea that uh, no no government program can alter the inevitability of reality crashing down on us.
Oh,
And uh, and you're helping me see how the way I'm thinking is related to you to what you're thinking, but uh, everything from debt collapse to uh, to literally propping up entire populations of the country that can't support themselves, uh, the problem will resolve itself. The deer population will go down eventually.
sure. And kind of to say to kind of speak to the example with the deer that you gave, uh, if you let it happen naturally, yes, there probably will be suffering. There will be adjustments and change can, it can be painful. But if you try to fight it off too hard, or if you don't do it smart, if you don't do it sustainable, you're just going to have much more devastating pain in the long run.
Yeah,
Because if
in
you let
general,
the population double, well, then half the population is going to have to die to reach that equilibrium again. Yeah,
yep. Oh, no, exactly. In general, the longer you wait to solve a problem, the worse the resolution's going to be.
sure. I mean, and I think we can all, relate that to the national debt. Pretty,
Oh, yeah,
it's
well, yeah.
very relevant for that. Which still
I think
people don't seem to realize is really important yet. I don't think it's hit most people yet, but
but then the human cost to me is so much more compelling to think about the cost in human lives. The question we have to ask ourselves, and from a humanitarian standpoint, not even a libertarian standpoint, is what happens when the euro crashes, when the dollar crashes, when the US defaults, when Germany goes the way of Greece? What happens to Africa when the UN food shipments stop? When all that foreign aid stops?
right.
When when Europe and the United States have impoverished themselves so much that Africa has to stand on its own 2 feet.
Right. Because you were saying earlier, this is you're the only person I've heard it from, but obviously I feel like you're a trusted source. But Africa the population has expanded to a large extent because of that foreign aid. Right.
Yeah, listen, I'm sure someone can disagree with me there,
Sure.
but Africa is the poorest continent, the one that receives far and away the most foreign aid, and the one that the population is increasing by a pretty good margin the most.
Sure.
So the most dependent population is the one that's increasing its population, thereby increasing the amount that they're dependent on other people.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
So, just as a thought experiment, what happens when the foreign aid stops? Because it will stop eventually.
Sure.
The human cost will be exponentially higher than if the foreign aid had just never started in the first place.
And even their position would have, if there was no foreign aid, barring, uh, crippling like local government controls, probably would have balanced itself out, and they would have found, entrepreneurship would have tried to fill in the gap of those who are hungry, those that needs people that need food, people that need, education and stuff.
Yeah, there's organic, sustainable ways to do these.
Exactly. But then, yeah, and then kind of the opposite side of that is if you throw too much foreign aid at a population or a country or a region, their incentive for actually growing their own food and creating their own products and services drops because there's this artificially low supply flooding the market, basically.
Well, liberals, turn off your computer, turn it on mute for 10 seconds. But, um, actually, the colonies were pretty sustainable, but white guilt didn't let that continue.
Sure, yeah.
Um,
The ugly truth is that it was, from my layman's understanding, is better than kind of the chaos that they are experiencing now.
yeah, yeah. This is some pretty heavy red pilling, but
Right? Yeah.
if you still think the colonies damaged the countries, you really need to dig into some alternate sources. Um,
Sure, but
the colonization of those countries was inhumane in some regards, and you can't excuse that. What you
absolutely.
can say is that the standard of living of the colonized peoples, they would have never traded it back.
Oh, of course, yeah. Um, I think the last point that when I sat down to think about this, some of the ways, you know, that kind of follow the thesis that reliance on government or central planning for society is uh, is a way of rejecting science in an area, at least for organizing society. I believe also that in doing so, a lot of people, probably the majority, reject empirical evidence. This is both on the left and the right. This is not. Uh, I hold no party affiliations uh, because, as we know, I think if you look at the results of many government programs, most, if not all, create more problems than they solve. And if you were really uh, invested in the outcome being a better society, that is better for everybody in society, you would see the results of all these policies like the drug war, the war on terrorism, uh, economic interference in the market, all these things. You would see the outcome and go like, oh, okay, we should maybe reconsider the means that we're taking to these ends. And so
Sure.
it's almost like the whole ends and means part of it is rejected, and people are only led by their intentions. And I think,
Yeah, 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 Ben. Let me maybe push back on you a little bit
sure,
there. Um, it's it's a little bit rich to me to hear someone uh, on a big news station say, "Listen, Jim, the war on drugs has been a terrible, terrible failure, and we need to cut this out." And and that's a little rich to me because they make it sound like it couldn't have been known and obvious beforehand that it's not going to work.
right.
There's schools of thought, there's philosophies and economic models that tell you before it even starts that this is going to be a failure. And so the lesson they learn is, oh, it was just terribly implemented. We're looking at this all the wrong way. They never look back far enough to go, actually, there was, you know, economic models and philosophies that tell us this is a disaster before we even start the process.
Oh, absolutely. And I think I might have jumped the gun on myself a little bit. The first part, obviously, is you're right. People do upfront kind of reject the means of attaining something. Because like
Sure.
we have philosophy, we have economics, we have theories of thought, for
Yep.
predicting the future, which is kind of what science is useful for, right? Um,
Yep.
but yeah, we haven't figured out yet that pointing guns at people and writing down moral commandments on paper isn't
Well,
necessarily
yeah.
effective.
Yeah. You know, God damn it, it's just too convenient to look at everything in history and figure out that when you violently make someone do something, there's
Yeah,
consequences.
they're not going to like it, and people are going to
Yeah.
fucking revolt,
You
and people
know,
are going to
we
get hurt.
can't. Yep. Yeah. We just don't have quite enough centuries of evidence to
Yeah.
really back this claim up
No,
yet.
seriously, Ryan, communism will work. You just have to implement it right. You just have to do it right. You have to get the right dictator. You have to get the right, economic council and czar, and uh,
That's right.
but yeah,
Yeah, those were just oligarchs pretending
oh
to be
yeah,
communists.
exactly. They weren't true proletariats. Ugh.
Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah. Oh,
um, you know, yeah, I just it kind of pisses me off when I think about the human cost of all of this. Um, and karma always comes back. Reality always comes back.
yeah.
And when you think about the wealth that has just been destroyed through government force, it's a crime on the highest order.
Without a doubt. I think last year, government through civil asset forfeiture took more property and money from Americans than thefts did.
And Ben, that's only part of the visible cost.
Oh, sure, absolutely. That's the measurable cost. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
and
the invisible
the
costs
catch with
are just
yeah,
criminal.
and the catch with civil asset forfeiture is you don't even need to convict somebody of a crime. Like
Yep.
at the federal and the state level, they can just do it only if they think you are part of a crime, and they've used that to steal thousands of dollars from people just driving down the road. They've used it to steal houses and cars, and the big perversion is that they use that money gets funneled into the department to fund it, and so oh. Is there a problem with that? Is there a conflict of interest in there?
Well, that's the example of I have no source, no evidence, no town to reference you, but there's that story of the cops who they could point to you and say that's the guy smuggling drugs into our city,
Oh,
but they don't pull him over when he's going into the city to sell drugs. They pull him over when he's leaving with all the cash he made. Because if you pull him over with the drugs, the department doesn't get the cash.
oh.
Now they now they have a bunch of drugs that they can't do anything with. You pull him over after he sold the drugs, the department keeps all the cash.
Oh, of course, yeah. And actually, I made a video about giving reasons why there is no real private property in the U.S. And I'll link that down below for anybody who would like to hear more depressing things about society. Even though we do live in the richest, most prosperous, freest country still, we all won the lottery by living in the U.S. nowadays. But
Yep.
doesn't mean it can't be better. Doesn't mean we can't refine things and evolve, if you will, if the government will let us. All right, yeah, I think that about wraps it up. Just to kind of summarize, I think everything we said, basically, believing that essential authority can plan society and conduct all of the experiments needed to find the knowledge that we need to improve our lives, because there's millions and millions of different interactions and things and situations and problems we have in society. And so the more experimentation we can do, the better. And the problem with trying to turn to a central authority to do this is that it pushes out everybody else's ability to experiment, and more importantly, their ability to implement any new knowledge and efficiencies that they find for improving society. And thus, relying on the government is a rejection of science. And I guess everyone can do with that information as they will. Thank you, Ryan, for joining me for this little talk, this little jam session. And we'll talk to everybody later. That was Liberty Theory.